Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Secrets and Spies present Need to Know. Need to Know is a podcast featuring conversations with security experts focused on the terrorism and intelligence stories dominating the headlines. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr. This is Need to Know.
On today's episode of Need to Know, I'm joined by intelligence historian and author Calder Walton, and we discuss the report into Russian interference in UK politics by the Russian intelligence services. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider supporting it by becoming a Patreon subscriber. You can subscribe by going to patreon.com/secrets and spies. Also, if you like the work that I'm doing on this podcast, you may enjoy my short film, The Dry Cleaner. The Dry Cleaner is my first attempt at spy fiction, and it's now available on Amazon and iTunes. And if you're into social media, please connect with this podcast on Facebook and Twitter. If you go to Facebook, it's just www.facebook.com/secrets and spies. And if you go to Twitter, it's just @secrets and spies. You'll tend to find me more on Twitter than Facebook. If you want to drop me a line, Twitter's probably the best place to find me. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you very much for listening. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Calder, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
No, it's great to be back. Thanks for having me, Chris.
For the benefit of new listeners, can you just please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm a historian at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am assistant director of the Applied History Project, which seeks to inform policymaking by looking at history. And I also help to run the Harvard Kennedy School's Intelligence Project research component.
Fantastic, fantastic. Earlier this week, the UK government finally published its long-awaited report into Russian interference in British politics. A report that, it must be noted, was ready for distribution back in October 2019, but it was held back at the request of the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, just before the 2019 general election. A few reactions to the report so far. Dominic Grieve, who was the chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, who wrote the report, wrote an article in The Guardian, and he states, "The Russian report points to willful negligence by the British government." Leader of the UK Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, accused the government of delaying legislation to help counter Russian interference, despite acknowledging 18 months ago existing powers were insufficient. Edward Lucas, who has been warning about an increasingly aggressive Russia for years and was largely ignored, points the finger at naivety towards Russia through successive British governments since 1994. In a piece for the Daily Mail, he points out that the changes to the UK investor visa program allowed wealthy Russians to convert their visas to British passports, which entitled them to all the rights those documents grant, including the ability to make donations to political parties. He noted that the report concluded the key to London's appeal was the exploitation of that visa scheme. So Calder, first of all, what are the kind of key points of the report that stood out for you?
There are several things that stood out to me. I think the most striking aspect is the extent to which Britain's intelligence services, guided by their political masters, appear to have completely taken their eyes off the ball in terms of Russian meddling over recent years. This seems to be an absolutely a fundamental strategic failure on the part of the British quote-unquote secret state to recognize and take seriously the Russian threat of meddling. I think that gets to the heart of a really important question in terms of intelligence, security, and requirements, or tasking is called within the intelligence business, of how intelligence is gathered and given to decision makers.
Yeah.
The problem seems to have been that, looking at the report, that the issue of Russian meddling in British elections and the Brexit referendum was such a politically hot potato. I think that was the phrase they used in the report.
Yeah.
That nobody wanted to go there. Nobody wanted to take ownership for that and to investigate what skeletons would be found in the cupboard if we opened up that door. Nobody wanted ownership for it, and therefore nobody tasked the intelligence services, MI5, SIS, and I imagine GCHQ, to investigate this in a way that they would with other threats. It has to be said that, of course, there were and are other high priority national security threats, counterterrorism, which simply surpassed these requirements on a day-to-day level. But what we're talking about with Russian meddling in British elections, as within the US and other Western elections, really goes to the heart of the effective operation of a democracy. If you can't trust your elections because foreign actors have interfered in it, then democracy by definition is not working. Yeah. As I said, nobody wanted to go there. Nobody tasked. It appears few people tasked Britain's intelligence services to investigate this in any meaningful way. And really that gets to the point of whether agencies like the security service MI5 should essentially be self-tasking. So that's not easy, and that there's no right answers, wrong answers with this. Self-tasking is there's a slippery slope there where a security service can become a rogue elephant, to use the infamous phrase used in the Church Committee report about CIA abuses in the 1970s here in the US. A security service, intelligence agency that sets its own agenda and decides what it's going to investigate. There are all sorts of worrying civil liberty implications about that. But at the same time, we're now seeing it's exposed the problem of, if in the as your listeners might know or remember from their other studies or whatever, about the intelligence cycle, that intelligence services rely on tasking from political leaders, and it's a circular flow of this is what I need to know, set the requirements, task the subjects, collect, analyze, disseminate back to the policymakers. If no input driver is being given by political masters because it's such a politically charged subject, then we don't get the collection and we don't get the analysis. I think the report illustrates or names an MI5 report of a pithy few sentences that was only a few sentences long and cited open source academic studies about Russian meddling, clearly not providing a margin of information from secret sources, which is the whole purpose of what a intelligence agency is supposed to do. If you're just simply referencing, people are just Googling academic works like anyone else could do, then what's the point? Seems to me.
Yeah. I remember we talked about that with Bellingcat, didn't we? And
exactly. So the phenomenon of skeletons in the closet and political decision makers not wanting to go there and open that door is not unique to Britain. Of course, exactly the same thing is happening in the US with Trump and Russia. And it was, as your listeners will doubtless remember, over the course of a couple of years, it required a special counsel investigation by Robert Mueller into Russian meddling to actually get to the bottom of some issues, not all of the issues about Trump and Russia. Some he purposely didn't investigate. So politically charged issue, a leader doesn't want to go there. It's unsurprising that there's much of an intelligence investigation. The answer is, I think, for intelligence agencies to have greater scope to be self-tasking about issues that they see as threats to national security.
Yeah, it's a bit of a pop. This is sort of a consequence of a potpourri of causes. I mean, back in the sort of mid '90s, I remember people even questioning what the point of MI5, MI6 was anymore, because Russia was seen as no longer a threat. The Cold War was over, and I think that optimism, kind of certainly in the public domain, kind of carried on even up to potentially the Litvinenko killing, maybe even a bit beyond. Because I remember when I was starting this podcast, when talking to just people about Russia, people would poo-poo it as a plot of a bad Cold War movie. Yet we have also had, like in the States, you had the Anna Chapman kind of sleeper spies in 2010, wasn't it?
That's right.
And I remember I was chatting with Gordon Carrera, and even the arrest of those spies became political because at the time they were renewed. There was the Obama reset of relations with Russia, and and it happened to all coincide with a talk with the Russian president who was in America at the time the arrests happened, and there was a worry it would cause embarrassment. So it's difficult, isn't it? It's sort of politics, diplomacy, kind of collide with law enforcement and intelligence priorities, and
so there's several strands there I'd like to sort of pull at, but it seems to me you're quite right that in the early mid 1990s this was, as we all heard at the time, the end of history. We don't need to know about the past. This is the end of history. Western liberal democracy is triumphant. Now we can see quite clearly, a quarter of a century after the collapse of 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, how mistaken that view was. And in fact, what we can also now see is that although the Soviet Union collapsed, for many powerful people in the Kremlin, not least Putin himself, who rose to power at the end of the 1990s, the Cold War never really finished. The same strategy, the same methods, the same techniques, the same overwhelming power of intelligence services within Russia continued into the post-Soviet period. I've recently interviewed a former head, someone very senior in the SBR, who said, quite simply, you guys in the West thought that the Cold War ended. For us, it never did. And now we are seeking revenge for the demise of the Soviet Union. The book I'm working on that I'm hoping to, that I will be publishing next year, the provisional title is Spies, The Long Cold War, British, American, and Russian Intelligence. And this actually makes the argument that the Cold War, as not commonly understood, actually started much earlier than commonly supposed, that Britain and the US were actually engaged in the Cold War with the Soviet Union before they realized that they were, and that though the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Cold War strategy and tradecraft continued after, and that now we're in a new kind of Cold War. But actually, I argue that it's not actually a new Cold War. It's a continuation of a much longer Cold War with Russia. There have been a few interludes in the Second World War, for example, where Britain and the US were allied to Soviet Russia, and in the 1990s. But otherwise, there seems to have been this cold, clandestine intelligence war between Moscow, London, and Washington. The problem was that Washington and London didn't recognize that they were engaged in this battle at key moments. So this is part of a much longer term strategic problem and threat, perceived threats on both sides, it seems to me. And you're quite right that I'm working on your listeners might be interested. I've got a piece coming out in Foreign Policy soon, the journal Foreign Policy, which argues that this Russia report reveals how British intelligence has misunderstood, misidentified the Russian threat today. And in fact, there's a direct parallel with what British intelligence and British establishment did during the Second World War, where they again neglected the continued Russian threat. So in other words, during the Second World War, Britain was allied to the Soviet Union, and the Foreign Office said, absolutely no way are we going to be spying on an ally because good friend, gentlemen don't spy on other gentlemen and allies don't spy on allies.
Yeah.
What we now know is that by the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union had launched a ruthless clandestine attack on its Western allies. So really, there seems to be a parallel with where we are now, with a new Cold War setting in, and what happened in the Second World War with the Cold War setting in. In both occasions, there was and is a failure to recognize an underlying strategic threat, because it's a politically charged issue. Nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants to say we can't trust a wartime ally, or in today's context, this is too politically charged for us to go there. Let's not investigate. Let's just hope it all goes away. Some striking parallels. So your listeners might be interested in that piece when it comes.
No, definitely. We'll keep an eye out for that. One interesting thing that came up, and I'm going to quote Edward Lucas. He was talking about the Russian report, and there's a section in the report talking about the Russian influence campaign during the Scottish independence referendum, and how there was evidence for it, yet MI5 didn't seem to think it was worth investigating. And now Scotland strategically is quite interesting because our submarine bases are there.
That's right.
And I wonder if the Scottish independence and Russia's interest in that is because of those submarine bases. I could be wrong, but
there could be an element of it. I think it's probably the biggest strategic aim with Scottish independence is for Russia is simply to undermine the cohesion of Great Britain, and anything that could be done to destabilize the Union would, in this sort of zero-sum game perception, for Russia, be seen anything that can be done to undermine a perceived adversary, Britain, would be beneficial for the Kremlin.
Yeah. So what do you think all this means for the future of the British security services? Because one thing that was happening just before this report, just a few weeks ago, it was reported that Dominic Cummings, who's a government advisor, was visiting the headquarters of all the intelligence services as part of his defence review. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to see sort of what the future for British intelligence is, because there's always been talks of possible mergers between MI5 and MI6 to turn into some sort of super agency and all that kind of stuff. What do you think might happen?
Well, that's whenever there's a sort of existential crisis, be it the start of the Second World War, the end of the Cold War, and I guess what we're going through today, right now, with definitely with coronavirus and Russian meddling. There's always talks about reforming Britain's intelligence services, merging them. What's the point of having two? Well, I think there's a long-standing purpose of having two that do very different work. Security intelligence, defensive is very different. It's than foreign intelligence gathering. Always has been and always will be. The difference between gamekeepers and poachers. And you don't generally, the two generally don't mix. So what will the future hold? It seems to me that the issue of Russian meddling, and the report, what it identifies, be it in the Scottish independence referendum, be it in the lurking issue of the Brexit referendum, which was just seems to have been sort of airbrushed away, be it in the recent 2019 UK general election, what the big issue is information warfare. And information warfare conducted over cyberspace, that the cyber realm is the new battleground for the Cold War. Neil Ferguson, my colleague here, has called it a war in Siberia, which I think is quite good, cyberspace. And I think that evokes the idea very well. Information warfare, what does it mean for intelligence services? The intelligence services will have to, in the 21st century, rethink how they understand intelligence to be, and so will political masters. That premium already seen, but the premium on open source intelligence about globalized threats. It seems to me that the major theme of this century will be globalized transnational threats. Yes, be it terrorism, as 9/11 showed, and the wake-up call for that, but also biological threats like pandemics, either from naturally occurring diseases or from synthesized biology. We're on the verge of absolutely watershed, groundbreaking biological biorevolution. Anyone that wants to get, any of your listeners that want to get very scared, I recommend reading the McKinsey Global Institute's report published in May this year about the biorevolution, to have a look at the technology that we're on the verge of and the profound social and national security implications that this has. And also information warfare, using old-fashioned techniques, but because of the development of cyberspace, allowing the dissemination and the consumption of information and disinformation in ways that are unprecedented.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of globalized threats, as well as the big one looming in the back of everything that we do, which is the transnational global threat of climate change or climate crisis. So intelligence, what we're seeing right now, will need to change in order to address those transnational threats, many of which are hiding in the open. Therefore, the old ideas of secrecy and the shackles of secrecy, I would call it, from the Cold War, from the 20th century, need to be cast off, and intelligence services and intelligence agencies, Britain among them, need to rethink the public-facing nature of intelligence and their role to provide intelligence about globalized threats that should be geared for public dissemination.
Aside from the UK government report, the Russian intelligence service has been quite busy. A few weeks ago, a story broke in the New York Times claiming that it had been discovered that the Russian government had been paying bounties to the Taliban to target and kill US and allied forces in Afghanistan. What are your thoughts on the Russian bounty story?
Well, it is an absolutely extraordinary story. And it's also absolutely extraordinary that, as of this point, I do not believe Trump's White House has made a statement denouncing the alleged Russian bounties. This, alas, once again, goes straight to the heart of President Trump's peculiar, unusual, unique relationship with Russia. And what is it about Putin and Russia that makes Trump so unwilling to criticize anything that it does?
Yeah.
The idea in any other presidency over here, the idea that a US president would not, first and foremost, publicly denounce the alleged bounties by Russia to kill US soldiers is just absolutely striking. What I don't know, and again, any of your listeners who are more versed in this than me, is the extent to which, for example, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, whether the CIA offered bounties for the Mujahideen to kill Soviet soldiers. So what I'm really getting at is the principle of bounties is not unusual in warfare. Clearly that it's not unique to Russia, but it is unique, I think, that we have not heard a denunciation from the Oval Office about this.
Yeah. I mean, especially when you compare it to, and it's hard to not compare it, but to the reaction of the Benghazi attacks.
Precisely.
There were calls for Obama and at the time Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's resignations and all sorts of things.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I've forgotten the number of hearings that Benghazi produced, but it was a phenomenal. And so far, as with everything at the moment in this country, and I imagine it similar over there back in the UK, stories simply get taken over by other current events.
Yeah,
and particularly amid the pandemic, where the news is changing and is so profoundly bad each day in this country that suddenly Russian bounties stories from 20 days ago, I think, it seems like a distant memory. I mean, it's often also sometimes easy to forget that President Trump was actually impeached. That seems like an eternity ago, but such is life in the new era of digital disinformation and globalized interconnectivity.
Calder, before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts on anything we've discussed today?
It seems to me that whether Britain and the United States like it or not, we are actually already in a new Cold War. I would argue that it's not really a new Cold War. It's simply a continuation of a much longer term Cold War between Russia and the West.
Yeah. Well, Calder, thank you very much for joining me today. Where can listeners find out more about you and your work?
Absolutely. I'm on social media. Twitter is at Calder_Walton. I've got a website, and you can find me through Harvard Kennedy School's website. Happy to respond to any and all questions. I love the subject, and I want to make other people interested in it and take it seriously.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me today. It's been brilliant.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for listening. This is Need to Know.